My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College, Dr. Adam Myers. Welcome to State of the State.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
The Rhode Island Constitution provides for a constitutional convention every 10 years. The last one was in 1986, and voters have turned down a referendum on whether or not to convene another one ever since. This year, the voters are being asked if we should have another constitutional question. It will be question 1 on the ballot in November. The 1986 convention was unlimited, which means the convention could look at the entire document, not just specified sections, and it resulted in 322 resolutions considered by the delegates and were condensed down into 12 questions that were put to the voters. 100 delegates from all municipalities met in 2 locations, and that included 12 meetings with the public where they could comment. The president of the convention was an attorney, Kevin McKenna, a lawyer with a very forceful personality, and the secretary was a young, wheelchair-bound politician named Jim Langevin. Bruce Sunland, who had declared his candidacy for governor, was also a delegate and was challenged, but a judge ruled that Sunland could stay. 14 ballot questions were presented to the voters. One question that was passed, for example, in 1986, increased the terms of the general officers from 2 years to 4 and set a 2-year limit. One that was rejected was a prohibition against abortions. So there's a wide range of topics. In 1994, 2004, 2014, again, there was a rejection of an idea of another constitutional convention. Now here we are in 2024 debating the subject again. Now, some people argue that a constitutional convention is democracy in action. However, Rhode Island, like the United States, is a republic. We elect delegates to represent us. And my understanding is that this year there would be 75 delegates, 1 from each of our House districts, which means that the vast majority of delegates would be from the urban core of the state: Providence, Cranston, Warwick, North Providence, East Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket. We might throw in Aquidneck Island and Woonsocket. The suburbs and rural areas would be a minority, similar to the Republican minority in the General Assembly. And they can make noise, but what they say isn't really going to matter. Do you agree with that characterization, Dr. Myers?
Yeah, I largely do. I think you described the way a convention would work accurately. There's a lot of decisions that the General Assembly would have to make about the statute that would enable the convention to go into effect if the voters voted for it. They would have to decide, for example, if the 75 delegates would be chosen via partisan or nonpartisan elections. I'd be in favor of nonpartisan elections, but that's something the General Assembly would decide. But in general, I think you described the process pretty well.
Yeah, and so the first step is for the voters to decide yes or no on a convention. Next step, the legislature has to set ground rules by legislation that said this is what you're going to do, or how you're going to address it. Is it going to be an unlimited? They could limit it. They could just say you can only look at certain sections. I mean, all bets are off. So that would be interesting. And then when they finally meet, they have to find a place. Obviously, there has to be a budget, because last time they broke up into a bunch of different, I guess they call them commissions or committees.
Yep.
And so you're probably going to have lawyers hired to advise them. And even though some members might be lawyers, you still want independent counsel looking at some of this stuff. And then the whole process has to evolve before they start having hearings. So it's quite complicated, actually.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Myers, the former district court judge, and I believe a former law school teacher, Stephen Erickson, is an advocate for a constitutional convention. And he recently wrote a piece outlining the topics he thinks should be addressed. And I believe you support the idea of a convention too. So allow me to use Judge Erickson's treatise as a guide for some of our discussion, if you will. He is an activist who believes the Constitution is as he calls it, a living document that needs to adapt to the current wishes of citizens. Do you share his view of the Constitution as a living document?
I think that when he uses that term, or at least in my mind, that calls to mind debates over judicial interpretation of the Constitution, either state or federal, right? In other words, should we interpret it according to its original meaning when it was ratified, in the case of the Rhode Island Constitution in '86, or in the case of the federal Constitution in 1789, or does it kind of evolve over time? To me, that's a separate question from the question that the voters of Rhode Island need to answer in November, which is, should the people exercise their right of self-government and reconsider the political institutions under which they live, right? How to interpret the Constitution that might come about from the convention is a separate question. Then it's a question for judges. But the question of whether or not the Constitution as a whole needs to either be revised or amended, I think that's something that the voters of Rhode Island should weigh in on. And I personally think they shouldn't be afraid. I think we should take the plunge and see what happens.
So the perspective that I sense what you're saying is, we can call it a constitutional convention, but really what we want to see is some discussion of like the way the state operates. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You know, there's all sorts of institutions that were set up by the '86 Constitution that we might want to reconsider. For example, the '86 Constitution opted not to have a citizen initiative process, right? In other states, like Colorado, California, Washington, even our neighbor to the north, Massachusetts, has a modified version of it. In those states, people can bypass elected officials under certain circumstances and put things on the ballot for others to vote on, right. Things that the politicians might not want. And
like term limits.
Like term limits, exactly. The reason why in states like California and Colorado there are term limits on state legislators, but not here in Rhode Island, is because politicians are never going to vote to term limit themselves, right? The only way we could get term limits for the legislature in Rhode Island is if we had a citizen initiative option. Now, whether term limits are a good idea or not is a separate question. I'm not weighing in on that. Okay. I'm just saying I think that this is the kind of thing that ordinary citizens should be able to weigh in on. And currently, there's no way for them to do that. The only way for them to do that is via a constitutional convention.
Yeah, I think you know, the idea of term limits is very appealing to a lot of people, because I frankly don't think, looking at the federal Constitution, the framers never envisioned a political class, you know, and they did not in any way envision the size of government, either at the state or the federal level. I mean, one of the interesting things that a few years ago, I visited the old State House, and I actually sat in the benches, and I said, you know, this was it. You know, there wasn't this big buildings all over filled with elected officials, appointed officials, and public employees. It just wasn't conceived of.
Yeah, so you bring up a lot of interesting points. I guess I would agree and disagree with you there. The founders, certainly of the U.S. Constitution, certainly didn't conceive of government the way we have it today. But I think they did value political expertise. And remember, under the original Constitution, the U.S. Senate, first of all, served 6-year terms. That was a long time back then,
yep.
Right? And the original U.S. Senate was not even elected by the people. It was elected by the state legislatures. Right. And that was a way of insulating the U.S. Senate from popular pressure and from and making it a more sort of removed expertise sort of laden institution. And so I think the founders did value having a background in politics. They were all seasoned politicians. Yeah. Having said that, you know, the House, you know, they set it up so that people only served 2-year terms, right? Because they wanted direct recourse to the people. Right. So you can look at it in different ways. The topic of term limits for state legislatures is a complicated one because we have a lot of evidence from the states that have implemented it. And the reviews are mixed, right? Mm-hmm. When you decrease the power of the legislature by making state legislators term limited, you increase the power of the governor, right?
Yes.
And I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea. You also increase the power of lobbyists, right? Because term-limited politicians don't have as much knowledge, so they have to rely more on lobbyists. So there's pros and cons.
Yep.
But I do certainly agree that this is something we need to discuss.
Yeah.
And as long as we don't have a constitutional convention in Rhode Island, there's no forum to discuss it.
I've lived here for 50 years, and I frequently look at, we are the smallest state in the union, maybe 1,000,001 population. And I often say, why do we have a bicameral legislature?
Yep.
I mean, and the only answer, and I've asked numerous politicians about this, and the only answer I got is, well, we're part-time, so one house upsets the other, or checks their, but still a lot of legislation gets through, and it's a mess, and then it has to be corrected later on. And so to me, having this system of 75 seats in the House and I guess 38 in the Senate, and they both serve 2-year terms. So there's not even that kind of a balance, at least at the federal level. As you said, the original term was 6 years, and they were appointed by the state legislatures or the governor, I forget which.
The state legislature for the U.S. Senate, yeah.
And that was changed. So the Constitution in that sense became a living document because they actually changed that. But yet the Senate is supposedly a more deliberative body, and because they're there longer, they tend to have a different set of rules, and people sometimes don't understand that.
I completely agree with what you just said. So the fact of the matter, and I wrote a whole paper about this, which you can look up. It's in a journal called Studies of American Political Development. Why in state after state, every state except Nebraska has a bicameral legislature. And it really makes no sense because, as you just said, at the state level, the two chambers do almost the same thing. They're chosen in the same way.
Yep.
It's
and
not
same
like
term, same term.
Same terms. It's not like in the federal system where in the U.S. Senate representation is by state, right? Representation is according to population in both the state House and the state Senate. So it really doesn't make sense to duplicate responsibilities. No. Politicians are never going to vote to downsize the legislature into one chamber because then a whole bunch of them would be out of jobs.
And their staffs and all their friends. Yeah.
That's right. So my view is, that's a reform that I don't think people are passionate about, for better or worse. But that's certainly a reform that a constitutional convention could discuss.
Yeah. Judge Erickson is a strong advocate for the mentally ill, and he thinks their voting rights, I'm going to quote what he says, should be better protected and not curtailed by false claims of election irregularities. Do you see this as the kind of issue a constitutional convention should address?
So I don't know exactly what he's proposing.
Well, he isn't clear on that either. He just wants to protect their voting rights. I don't see any threat to them, but go ahead.
Listen, I think the right to vote should be protected in the state constitution. It is in the current constitution. Perhaps there are changes to the voting system that we might consider to make our elections work better. For example, a lot of folks in America today are interested in something called ranked choice voting, right?
Oh, we're going to get, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. We might as well get it.
Well, okay. So, this is a reform that's been tried out in Maine and in Alaska. A lot of people have promised that this reform will deliver all sorts of things. I don't know if it's as effective of a reform as its proponents claim, but under the current Rhode Island Constitution, we can't have it for our general elections, right? And so I think it's worth asking whether or not it's something we want to implement in our general elections, and the only way to do that would be in the form of a constitutional convention. So that's one of many institutional reforms that I think we should consider, and that the General Assembly would never consider unless they're forced to. And so, as far as ranked choice voting goes, if you're asking me about my personal views on it, I think it might be worth it for Rhode Island to experiment with it in a limited fashion.
But in primaries, for example?
Right, and that wouldn't require a change to the state constitution. The General Assembly could just pass a law to do that. But I think it might be worth it for the state to experiment with it in general elections too. And again, we could start off just with state constitutional offices, or with the federal races before we go on to the state race, the state legislative races.
Yeah, because the states can set the rules for those, even the federal offices.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So we've had several guests over the last few years who have been advocates, and frankly, they like the idea somehow of paring it down so there's only two candidates and the two most highest vote getters, but when you start talking about how you put it into effect, it gets a little hazy. And I'll give you an example. The town I live in, all 5 members of the town council serve 2-year terms, and they're all up every 2 years. So a couple of years ago, we had 15 people
Right.
vying for 5 seats. So what would happen? I mean, I don't understand how ranked choice voting solves anything except creates the need for a series of elections to pare the thing down, or else you have a computer program deciding who you want to vote for.
Right. Well, you in most states and municipalities that have implemented it, you rank order up to 5 candidates, right? So it's a little bit more simple than having to rank order 15 of them. But I take your point. And it is an issue that it is a concern I have with ranked choice voting. The idea that if it were put into place, we'd be voting for, 5 people for governor, among 5 people for governor, 5 people for U.S. Senate, 5 people for Attorney General, 5 people for U.S. Congressman, and so forth. I don't think people already don't know half the folks on the ballot. It would
Correct.
be even more cumbersome to vote if there were if there were that number of people on the ballot and people needed to rank order them. To be perfectly honest, I would like, if we had a constitutional convention, for the convention to consider a somewhat more radical electoral reform, which is proportional representation. I think that it's a real problem in this state that we only have, and I think it's a problem nationally too, but in Rhode Island in particular, we only have 2 political parties. And let's face the truth, in a state like this, the National Republican Party is never going to gain much traction. Yeah. So all of the competition occurs within the Democratic Party. Yeah. That's a problem for democracy because Democratic primaries, where all the action is, are very low turnout affairs. Yeah. I would rather have more action at the general election level, right? And the best, really the only way that I can think of to do that is to increase the number of parties in this state so that, potentially rather than just having a Democratic Party composed of some moderates or moderate conservatives and some progressives, those 2 groups could split up into separate parties. And the Republicans could, square off against both of them. I think that would be healthy. And even if it didn't work out, we could eventually revise the electoral system again in a future constitutional convention. And if it did work out, we could be a model for the entire country. Because I think a lot of people in this country are very frustrated with what some commentators call the 2-party duopoly. The truth of the matter is, though, because of our institutions in the United States, it's very hard to have more than 2 political parties. We would have to change a lot of things, most notably our first past the post voting system in order to get more than 2 political parties. And I think it would be worth it for Rhode Island, little Rhode Island, to experiment with alternative voting systems that maybe the rest of the country could adopt.
Yeah. As you well know, we've had 3 parties on various elections, and most famously we had the Cool Moose Party. And then Mr. Ken Block formed the Moderate Party. And then when he ran the next time as a Republican and didn't get the nomination, they resurrected Bob Healy from the Cool Moose Party to run. Right. And the result was the persons who were elected did not receive a majority. They were elected by plurality, starting with Link Chafee, I guess. Right. So the multiple party system is, that carries that risk with it, because you end up with someone that only gets 30% of the vote because there's 5 candidates or whatever,
Right. So that's where ranked choice voting for the governor's race might be good, right? It would solve that problem. But I'm just suggesting that for General Assembly races, we might consider something other than ranked choice voting. We might try to be a real model for the rest of the country and adopt a proportional representation system. No state in the Union has adopted a proportional representation system for its legislature. I think Rhode Island badly needs it, actually. And I'm suggesting we should
At least
play around
explore
with it.
it.
Explore
Yeah.
it.
The Constitution calls for a defined election day in November every year, right?
Right.
But we allowed citizens who are traveling abroad or perhaps in a hospital or nursing home or in the military who could not be present on election day, they could cast a mail-in ballot. Using the COVID-19 pandemic as cover, Democrat Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea declared a voting season back in 2020. And there's no provision for that in the Constitution, certainly. The Republican Party went to court and challenged that, and our Democrat Attorney General, Peter Noronha, refused to show up or failed to show up, so the judge says, well, if the state's not representative, we're not going to rule. So it went forward. And predictably enough, it has now been codified into law. I mean, clearly it benefited most of the Democrat incumbents. The mail-in ballots were numerous, and there is allegations, and I know personally, from personal experience, that my son, who has not lived here since 1989, received a mail-in ballot. And I easily could have scribbled his name and cast another vote if I didn't want to break the law or didn't mind breaking the law. But anyway, do you think that we need this voting season? I mean, do we have to really? I mean, some states are going to start voting for president in about a week. And so it's a voting season now, and anything can happen. I mean, between now and the day in November, which is supposed to be election day, and about 70% of the ballots last time were already cast by election day in the presidential race.
Right. So I think what I would say is this. I'm in general in favor of making it easier for people to vote. For the simple reason that if you compare the United States to other advanced democracies, our turnout rates in this country are far lower. And that's because election day is not an official holiday. It's in some cases hard for people to get to the polls in states where, election day, you can really only vote on election day. And in which mail-in balloting is very restricted. The number of those states is shrinking. I do agree with you that voting by mail is less secure than voting in person. I think that the evidence in the scholarly literature that there's been substantial vote by mail fraud is pretty limited. There was that one instance in that congressional race in North Carolina from, I think it was 2018. There was a ballot harvesting scandal there. Yeah. But I think it's pretty rare. But all that said, I understand why people are concerned. What I would say is that this is something that really should be discussed in a forum, right? What do we want our voting system to look like? Perhaps it doesn't need to be a voting season like you're suggesting. Listen, what I think, the way we used to have it in Rhode Island, where 90% of people voted on election day, right, in person, we're not going back to that. The cat's kind of already out of the bag. But perhaps we should have more early voting centers where people can vote in person in the 2-3 weeks before election day, and less vote by mail. That would give people more options but still via in-person voting. That's something that I think the convention might want to consider.
I think you're right. Are you aware that Ken Block has written a book about? Yeah. Have you read the book?
I haven't read the book.
I started it, and I had no idea that the Trump campaign actually came to him the day after the election and engaged him to investigate these things.
Right.
And should I give you a spoiler alert?
Go for it.
He couldn't find it anywhere, and he kept going back and telling him, no, there's nothing here in this state, and it was not well received by some of the diehard Trump people. But anyway, So I think that argument certainly doesn't hold much water for me, although I can tell you, as I said, from personal experience, I received a ballot that I could have cast for my son.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is not rocket science, right? When you vote by mail, it does, to some degree, increase the possibility for mischief because you're taking the ballot out of a secure location, right? It's really that simple.
Yep. Believe it or not, we're running a little bit short on time. And I'd like to give an example of one of the things that controversial things. I know that the commission that listened to people asking their comments about a constitutional convention, one of the things they came up with more restrictive, as they call it, Second Amendment language. But the present Section 22 of Article 1 of the Rhode Island Constitution simply says the right of people, the citizens, to own and carry a firearm shall not be infringed. And infringement means encroached upon. But what we've seen happening, each series of years, there's been little encroachments. And they seem almost like they're nibbling away at the edge of this thing. And I can give you the examples. First was raise the age of firearm purchases to 21. Then they went to the Domestic Violence Act, the Red Flag Act, the Safe Schools Act, and finally the High Capacity Magazine Act, which is still being appealed in the federal system. So isn't the risk of a constitutional convention that, and not just Second Amendment people, but well-organized and financed special interest groups will dominate the agenda?
That's definitely the risk. But my hope would be that it's important to keep in mind the national context here. There hasn't been a state constitutional convention anywhere in over 30 years, right? If Rhode Island held the state constitutional convention, this would attract national attention. And I think the people of Rhode Island would pay a lot more attention to it than they did back in '86. And so my hope is that all of that popular sort of attention and popular monitoring of the process would prevent the convention from being captured by special interest groups. Do I know that it would happen that way? No. But my view is it's worth taking the risk because people are so dissatisfied with the system right now, right? And if we're dissatisfied with the system, it seems kind of nonsensical to say, okay, we don't like it, but let's just keep it because the alternative could be even worse. Now, with regards to the Second Amendment issues you raised, it's important to bear in mind that nothing that this convention could do, no constitution that it proposes could contradict the federal constitution.
Right.
There's
that's
something
that's supreme.
There's the supremacy clause in the federal constitution where there's a conflict between state law, including state constitutional law, and the federal constitution and even federal statutes. The federal perspective wins out. And so right now you have a U.S. Supreme Court that has demonstrated that it's very intent on protecting its understanding of the Second Amendment, that it protects an individual right to bear arms. Nothing that the state of Rhode Island could do could undermine that. And so I think gun owners in particular can rest easy.
Okay, thank you. I've got tons of questions to ask you. We'd love to have maybe a part 2 if you're available, but what would you say in about a minute would be the most critical thing? Well, we got 30 seconds, so I've just been advised we have 30 seconds, so I'm just going to thank you for being here with us. Right. It's been a very great conversation. I hope you viewers have enjoyed it and found it interesting and informative, and I hope you'll join us for the next session of State of the State. Thank you. My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. This is part 2 of a discussion with Dr. Adam Myers, who is an associate professor of political science at Providence College. Welcome back to State of the State.
Thank you.
We had a very interesting conversation, and I hope you will watch part 1. We are talking about a constitutional convention, or the question of one, in the question 1 on the next ballot in November, and that will ask the citizens if they want to have a constitutional convention, the last one being held in 1986. Our present Constitution provides for a convention every 10 years if it is desired. And so, Dr. Myers, we talked about a number of things, and I'd like to kind of pick up our discussion a little bit. Some of the topics that have been raised include, for example, Inspector General. And do you have a view on a need for an Inspector General in Rhode Island?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think it's pretty clear that the disbursement of monies in this state and the actions of some of our departments and agencies warrant better monitoring. And I think that an Inspector General could certainly play an important role in that. Lots of other states have it. I'm not entirely sure why we don't. I know the General Assembly leaders are opposed to it, but once again, we should have the discussion, and in a convention, the General Assembly leaders wouldn't have as much power to shut down potential reforms as they have during the standard legislative process.
We've had several people seeking election or re-election who also advocate for that. And when we get to the point where I say to them, well, how's that going to work? Because we have an Auditor General now who is really a creature of the legislative branch. Where would an Inspector General reside? Is he going to be in the executive branch? He can't duplicate what's already being done on the legislative side. You know what I'm saying? Is it just going to be like a free-floating apex out there where this individual is like a, I don't know, just able to go anywhere, even in the judiciary side?
Yeah, I can think of maybe a number of different ways to do it. And we would have to look at the states that have this kind of office and how that the person is appointed, how long their term is, under what circumstances they can be removed. My guess is, and this is not an issue I've studied carefully, but my guess is that different states do different things. In some cases, there are probably gubernatorial appointees that stick around for, long stretches so that they're more insulated from the political process. I imagine there's some states in which the courts actually appoint them, which is, I don't know how well that would work in Rhode Island, but it's something that could potentially be done. This is what a convention could do, right? They could look at how the office of Inspector General works in other states, how they're appointed, how long they serve, all these kinds of things. And they could look at the relationship between these different institutional mechanisms, selection mechanisms, so forth, and how well the office actually works, right? And we could get a sense of what works and what doesn't, and how to best set up this office so that it is able to kind of curb all of this wasteful government spending where it exists.
Well, we did have a former Auditor General appear on this program several years ago after he left state government for the private sector, and he actually had a bill drawn up to cover, the responsibilities, how it would be governed, who would be eligible for it. In other words, we certainly expect the Attorney General, for example, to be a lawyer.
Right.
But contrast that with the General Treasurer, no requirements. So when I moved to Rhode Island, the guy who had the job was a pharmacist.
Right.
And the current incumbent has no financial background other than he was mayor for a while of Central Falls and he relies on his staff. So, but in the case of an Inspector General, there's always questions about, some people think, well, it should be another lawyer. Some people think, well, no, the person should have an accounting, public accounting or a fraud examination background. And some people really think that broad power should be very broad. I heard one advocate saying, well, they could look into the Washington Bridge thing before it happened.
Right.
Well, that's kind of a reach. I mean, because even before a problem happens, you can't have this agency going all around to all the quasi-public agencies and departments of government and the judiciary side and going, well, I want to look at this in case something happens. There's a lot of ways to how is this going to be controlled,
Oh, for sure. State government is very complex, and I can't imagine that an Inspector General, if we had one, would be able to look under the hood with regard to every single state department or agency and uncover malfeasance before it happens. Yeah. I don't think that should be our goal. That's an unachievable goal.
Right.
But hopefully they would be able to spot certain things and bring them to the attention of the public before they got out of control. think that's kind of the more realistic hope.
I'll be happy to send you to your office this proposal that this gentleman had advanced. I actually discussed his proposal with the Speaker of the House at the time. And the reaction was, as you said, the legislative side was concerned because the Speaker and the President and the Governor all got to appoint an equal number.
Right.
And the judiciary wasn't even involved, but and they said no, that shouldn't be. They all wanted more control over.
Right. That's always.
So anyway, one of the other things that we discussed the last half hour was ballot initiatives, and how about recall procedures for elected officials?
I'm less in favor of, because I think that adds a lot of instability into the political system. I mean, think about the way it's worked out in California, where in the middle of Governor Newsom's term, there was a recall effort which cost the state a ton of money, and distracted the governor and other elected officials for a long time. Yeah. The reality is, Governor Newsom was going to be up for re-election just a year later, right? So my view with regards to recall is as follows. If a governor or any other elected official is engaged in really inappropriate conduct, there is another way to remove them from office. It's called impeachment, right? I don't think that we need the people to weigh in the middle of the terms of most elected officials just because somebody who's unhappy with them has been able to, get a whole bunch of people to sign a recall petition. And I'm not, in general, enamored of the idea of having constant elections, which is what tends to happen in states.
Very expensive and time-consuming.
Exactly.
I think some people look at, I don't know, I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm not advocating this in any way, but some people are dissatisfied with the head of the Department of Transportation.
Right.
And so, but that is an appointed position, so a recall provision, the voters would not be able to recall an appointed position.
Nope.
So they can't even touch those anyway.
That's right. There's a process in place for, getting rid of department heads and so forth. Yeah. If, Mr. Alviti, if a lot of folks are dissatisfied with his performance, they need to speak with their elected officials about that.
And speak to the governor.
And speak to the governor.
And I certainly, at the municipal level, there are recall provisions that most cities and towns do have.
I don't know how often those are used.
They're not used that often, no. Removal of lifetime tenure for Supreme Court judges.
So that I'm very much in favor of.
Yeah.
Because we are the only state this is another thing, right? We're the only state in the union that follows the federal system in giving our Supreme Court justices life tenures with no, mandatory retirement age, which is what Mass does, for example. Most states actually elect their Supreme Court justices, right? I don't know if that's the kind of reform that we want in this state. There's other states that use what's called the Missouri plan. This is the approach to judicial selection that I really like. The governor gets a list of people recommended by the Bar Association for appointment to the state's high court. He chooses from among them. And then they're on the state's high court for a term, usually about 10, 15 years. At the end of those 10, 15 years, they have to be up for what's called a retention election, in which the people get to decide whether they want to retain this or that judge. And usually they don't know much about these judges and they vote to retain them. But in some cases, if the justice has made a ruling that was very controversial that a lot of people don't like, then the people vote not to retain them. In the states where it's been implemented, the Missouri plan I think has been really effective. It's a nice kind of middle ground between insulating Supreme Court justices completely by having no mechanism for the people to weigh in on them, which is what the federal system is, and just free-floating elections, which turn, the judicial selection process into a completely partisan affair. Yeah. So I think there's different things that we could look into.
I guess presently we do have sort of a Missouri system because my understanding is the Bar Association does present the governor with a list, and that whoever he selects has to be approved by the state senate.
Correct.
So there is almost that.
There is that part of it, but once they're on forever.
That's it. And that's not only at the Supreme Court level,
but the lower courts too.
Superior and District Court. The one place it isn't in effect is with the magistrates.
Right.
Now, a lot of people don't even know what a magistrate is, except I call them judges light, because they are appointed without legislative review, but they have a term limit. I forget what it is, but they do have a limited term in office. And we talked about former Judge Erickson, and one of the points that he raised in his treatise is the proliferation of magistrates in the judiciary needs to be curtailed. And he said, magistrates are appointed to a fixed term, unlike judges who enjoy a life tenure. He argues that, and I'm quoting, no one should have a case decided without their consent except by a judge, and only lawyers should be prosecutors. Do you think this is a problem that the CONCON should address?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's not something that I know a lot about, but I've read the same articles in the Projo and so forth that you have, which suggest that this is really kind of a covert part of the judicial system that's emerged since the judicial reform of the early 90s, which has kind of gotten out of control. And it seems like there's no movement on Smith Hill that I can see to reform it, which suggests to me that the politicians, they're comfortable continuing on with it the way it currently is.
Because it's possibly part of a political patronage system?
Quite possibly. I mean, you're making that speculation, not me, but I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I don't know whether it is or not, but it seems to me that this is what happens. I know a guy, well, Abraham Lincoln said a judge is a lawyer who knows a politician.
Right. Totally. So, again, I don't know all that much about it, but I do think there's some reason to believe that it's problematic, and it wasn't the way the system was intended to work when we had all the judicial selection reform back in the early 90s. And they're not doing anything about it on Smith Hill. So once again, if we were to have a constitutional convention, the Judiciary Committee, the committee in charge of restructuring the judiciary, would I think need to take a look at that.
Yeah. One of the other things that is proposed is a line item veto for the governor.
Yep. I'm very much in favor of that, because if we look around the country, we're really in the minority here in Rhode Island. 44 of the 50 states have it. And it doesn't really make sense to me that we don't. The idea that the legislature, via the legislative process, sends this incredibly complicated document, the state budget, to the governor. Remember, the governor, he's the only part of this process who is elected by the entire state.
Yes.
And can actually his role is to think about the interests of the entire state, not just a segment of the state, right? And the legislature, under the current process, sends the governor this gigantic budget, and then the governor either has to take it as a whole or leave it as a whole.
Yep.
And to me, that process doesn't really make much sense. I think it would be far better if the governor could say, I like these parts of the budget, but these parts over here, I think you've gone too far. I'm going to...
Or not far enough.
Or not far enough. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could do that too. And line item them out. And I think that would be a way for the governor to be able to exercise greater control over the state's spending. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, the governor, of course, is required to present a budget proposal.
Right.
To start, I guess it's due in January of each year when the session begins. And let's face it, the major effort in the House of Representatives is to develop the budget. I mean, yes, the Senate has theirs, but they pretty much follow what the House is going to do, because spending bills are supposed to originate in the House. So, yeah, they kind of supposedly meet to make a final budget. But you're right, it's a take it or leave it, one-shot deal. So if they're not giving enough money to schools, for example, the governor might say, no, you got to go back and look at this again.
Right.
And of course, the response is going to be, yeah, but we leave in January. We have until January to give you a budget. Now you're going to make us work all summer to come up with some others, you know?
That's right. So, but you make a good point. It could go, I mean, so, conservatives are oftentimes in favor of the line item veto because they think the governor will use it to restrain spending. It could, as you suggest, work the other way around.
Yeah.
The governor could insist that the legislature raise spending in certain areas. That's the thing about institutional reforms. People need to bear in mind, institutional reforms don't lock in a particular political outcome, right? The question isn't, do you want conservative or liberal public policy, right? When we're talking about setting up institutions, right? In normal politics, that is the question, right? But when setting up when setting up institutions, the question is, which institutions function best? Which institution facilitate more civic involvement on the part of the people, if that's something you care about, right? That's what people should be thinking about.
One of the other things that the committee or whatever it was of the legislature that listened to people's input came out with school choice. Mm-hmm. Do you have any opinion on that? I mean, frankly, I was just watching something last night about a school in the Bronx that takes all these young children, and they're a charter school, and they're extremely successful. All of the kids are going and getting AP courses and then going on to the most prestigious colleges and universities in the country out of very humble circumstances. And they actually have a lottery. That's how these kids are selected. And the people line up, and they go into a big hall, and they call the names of the students who are selected strictly by lottery because they get so many applicants. And yet, the teachers union is very much against this. They don't want school choice, even though the results are astounding. These kids they showed them, and they wear uniforms to school. Can you believe it? Little ties and nice sweaters, and so they come dressed to learn, and it's a longer school day. Until 5 o'clock,
Right.
Okay, so weigh in if you want.
Well,
as an educator.
I hear you. Look, so I'm a process guy. I like talking about the process issues. School choice is a policy issue, so I'm going to not share my personal view on that.
Okay.
But what I will say is this. The particular issue of school choice is something that the legislature should decide. But there may be issues in the state constitution that might bear upon that. For example, Senator Zurier is a passionate believer that the state constitution should protect a right to an education,
yes,
which the state Supreme Court could enforce, right? And
what does that exactly mean?
Well, so this is, again, when you put in these constitutional clauses, it's up to the courts to interpret them, right? This goes back to our discussion
yes,
of originalism versus living constitution.
Yeah.
So they would have to, so if we had that provision in the state constitution, then the 5 justices on the state Supreme Court would have to look at that provision. They would probably compare it to similar provisions in other states. Mm-hmm. And they would have to say, well, based on this provision, is the General Assembly doing its job of adequately providing for education for the young people of this state? Now, in other states, courts have used those kinds of state constitutional provisions to force the legislature to pony up more money, mm-hmm, for education, particularly in low-income school districts, right? But I don't know what what our 5 justices would do. So this is where those kinds of provisions interact with what the state Supreme Court looks like, yeah, right? And so it's hard to predict how all of these things would shake out.
Yeah, of course, we have what is known as the Carullo Act, which
right,
can force municipalities to put more money into the school system. And it's seldom used, enforced, but it is available, so they can do it. And I know some people have said that one of the other problems is that the municipalities are charged with raising the money, then they just turn over an allocation of that money, and the school department has to do with it what it wants.
Right.
And maybe the school committee should be in a position where they could raise the money by creating a tax rate, that would direct it to the schools.
Yeah.
But that's another possibility.
And that gets into state-local relations, too.
Exactly.
And that's another issue that the convention might want to address, is how much autonomy do we want to give municipalities in regards to setting property tax rates for schools and so forth?
Yeah. One of the other things that they're talking about is expansion of the public access to government records. Mm-hmm. Now we have what's called APRA now.
Right.
And a lot of people use that, and sometimes it's abused because a request comes back and they say, well, even if it comes from a legitimate news agency, they'll say, well, you have to pay for the copies, right, and so forth. And it can be used as a harassment by these public gadflies or whatever you want to call them. They go and say, well, I want copies of all this stuff. And so you have somebody sitting at, and they're probably never going to look at all of it, but they want all of it.
Right. Yeah, so well, two things. Again, that's an issue that I think the legislature needs to fix via rewriting the law. I don't think that would be something that a state constitutional convention would consider. But you make some really good points. Number one, the state agencies charging the media,
or citizens,
for these documents that should be, made publicly available, I think is pretty ridiculous. I think the Globe and the Projo were charged money for all of these documents related to the George Washington Bridge, and I think that's just silly. All the emails and so forth. Why in the world do these media agencies need to pay to get access to the emails in the DOT? So that's one thing. But then the other thing you mentioned is also true. I happen to know, because of folks that I talk to, that APRA is abused by a very small number of people who send a huge number of requests. Yep. And some of these are liberal activists, some of them are conservative activists, right? Regardless, the APRA shouldn't be abused in that way. It should be there so that citizens can gain access to documents that show what the government is doing. It shouldn't be there just for activists on X or Twitter or whatever to, just constantly get on their high horse. And so there needs to be some limits placed on what these gadflies can do.
Yeah, I've never had to use the act, but I know people who have. But sometimes those seemingly frivolous requests are based on the fact that they can't get answers. Right. From people who, the elected, you hear this all the time, transparency and accountability. Right. But I found that one of the things they don't want is transparency and accountability. Right. And the former state senator that represented me, when he was in office, he said he had lost his as he called it, his juice, because he was in favor of more transparency and a more open government. And so the leadership in the Senate at the time kind of pushed him to the side. And that's people wonder why we say that the Speaker of the House is the most powerful politician. Now, he's elected from one district. Right. But he is, because he controls the budget. And the way he controls the budget is the way he controls the House of Representatives. Because the budget is not voted on till the last night, or close to the last night, so that the governor, if you don't support the budget, the bills that you sponsored aren't going to see the light of day, because he's not going to call for them on a vote. That's the real world that we live in. And
so that is one reason why I think, for example, a line item veto could be a real game changer. Yep. It would increase the governor's power over the budget process and potentially limit the speaker's power a little bit. And I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's a very responsible job, obviously, because, and then you get into the whole thing about whether we should even consider having I believe in a full-time unicameral legislature with well-compensated people that meet maybe 10 months out of the year, because they might, they have to have a break sometimes. But, the problem I see with the current part-time legislature is that someone who's working for a company, it's very unlikely that they're going to go into their boss and say, I'm running for office, so for 6 months of the year, I got to be up on Smith Hill You know, and there's some nights I'm going to be there all night or half the
Yep.
night. I'm not going to be in the next day. Well, that's a reach, unless your boss has some political inclinations and you know there's some reason that they'll do it. But why do you know?
It's a very heavy load,
Yeah.
and it's partially for that reason that so many of our General Assembly races in this state are uncontested. I
Yeah.
mean, this year we have some of the highest rates of uncontested races in the country.
I believe it.
And it's mostly on the Republicans aren't fielding candidates in a ton of our
We
state
don't have
reps.
one in our town
There you go.
for both town council and school committee.
Yeah.
None. Zero.
Yeah. And so they were talking about local government, which is maybe an even bigger problem. But with regards to the assembly, a part of the reason is because who wants to show up on Smith Hill after the workday for 5-6 months for a year for, you know, $15,000 or whatever it is, for no staff? You know, it's a hard, long slog.
Yeah.
And the political science studies on this are very clear. The more well-compensated legislatures feature fewer uncontested seats, more competition in the elections. And so I think that's a reform that we should, because I mean, it's not paying them a little bit more and turning it into a full-time job for a certain part of the year is not going to break the state's bank account.
No, and frankly, the reason there's so many lawyers up there is it's business development for them.
Right.
So their firm says, yeah, go ahead, because they're making contacts and, you know, they can.
Right.
There's an advantage to the firm for having someone up there. And then you have the municipal employees, the number of municipal employees from, say, Providence that are actually in the House of Representatives or Senate. People don't realize this, you know.
Yes.
You look at their background and you say, wow, this is pretty amazing. And same thing with teachers and firefighters that have plenty of time. We're going to get some nasty email about this, but no, I mean, it's an interesting concept to have this constitutional convention. I think we may have high expectations, but it will be a long slog because it's not going to happen like this and everybody's going to agree on the whole thing. So,
I totally agree. And getting back to something I said in part one of the main reasons I would like us to have this convention is because I think that if it works, we could really be a model for the entire country, right? As I mentioned earlier, you know, if you look at the survey data right now, it's really depressing just how many Americans are dissatisfied with their government at both the federal and state level. Everybody seems to agree that things aren't working well.
Yep.
And I want to suggest to your viewers that it may not be working well, not because the people in power are corrupt and self-dealing. Some of them are, but a lot of them are good people. It may be because our institutions are outdated and need to be revised. And there's nothing wrong with getting together and thinking about how to make them better. And, you know, we used to have state constitutional conventions in this country regularly, right? Throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, it happened all the time. But we haven't had a single state constitutional convention in this country since the early 90s.
we have to wrap it up. It's been a fascinating conversation with Professor Adam, and I want to thank you for watching State of the State, and we're really running out of time, but please come back and see us again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.